and welcome to the Black Hat Bushcraft channel. Today I wanted to come out and construct a bow drill set off the landscape and just practice to make that set, create an ember, and then create fire. It's probably been a couple of months since I've made a bow drill set, so I'm sure I'm a little rusty on it, but it's something I have done many times over. And no matter how many times I do it, I still know that there's more to learn. I definitely am not an expert where it comes to making bow drills. The more times you practice making a bow drill, the more you'll come to understand the different variables that affect the outcome. Whether it's the downward pressure, whether it's the speed that you run your bow forward and backwards, whether it's the type of materials that you use, or even the angles on your notch, the way you carve that notch. You have to remember that making a bow drill fire is completing the triangle of fire: heat, oxygen, and fuel, and you have to have all three. When you spin that spindle on the hearth board, that creates the dust, which becomes your fuel. And then your notch has to be properly carved in so that you can get oxygen to that fuel, and then you have to create the right amount of downward pressure and speed to build up the right amount of heat to cause combustion. So the more you practice this, the more you'll understand how to easily create each of those elements in the right proportions to get a fire. Let's give it a try. The wood that we're looking at here is a piece of downed tulip poplar. This is where the top broke out of the tree. And it's been laying here something like a year or so it's dried out really good. And tulip poplar is an excellent bow drill wood. So I'm going to harvest a piece of this tree to use for my spindle and my hearth board. Whenever I cut off a piece of tulip poplar wood to craft a hearth board and spindle, the first thing I like to look for is the heartwood. Normally, you'll see a little green, dark yellowish circle here in the center, which is the heartwood of the tree, the hardest part. And then the outer light color parts of the wood will be the sapwood. Ideally, you want to be drilling into the sapwood when you make your bow drill set, as that's the softer part, so it makes it a little bit easier to get that ember. It can obviously be done either way, but if we can make the process easier, that's ideal. You can see on this piece that there's no visible heartwood. That means this is cured out really good. You can see I've already got a natural crack starting right here, which is going to be a good place to start to split this out and separate spindle from hearth board. The next step in the process is to split out this piece of wood so that we can separate the half that will become the hearth board and the half that will become the spindle. So I have a small anvil here on the ground just to keep my bow drill wood up off the wet ground. And when possible, I like to split things out with a camp axe or a small hatchet like this one. Very easy. We can see we have a really nice piece of wood here, very dry. And this should make an excellent bow drill set. This thinner piece will become my hearth board, and I'm going to get my spindle from right in here. All right, at this point, I want to thin down my hearth board. I'm just going to use my axe to smooth this out and get everything nice and flat. Now I want to come back on the back of this piece of wood where it's rounded and flatten that off too. That way, when I go to use the bow drill set, it won't rock on me. Now, I'm looking at this, and the area that I think that's going to be best for me to make my bow drill is going to be right here in this area. What I'm going to do is flatten that off on the front. And that'll give me a nice square surface where I'll carve my notch when that time comes. All right, so you can see after just a few minutes of working with my small camp axe what this looks like. I've got some nice squared off edges here. The board's nice and flat. Got it beveled off on the bottom so it shouldn't rock when I go to do my bow drill. And I think that this will actually be quite functional. So the next step in this process is to split out what I'm going to use for my spindle. And just looking at this piece of wood, what I have left after splitting out the hearth board, to me, this area here, right here, looks like it'll be the best opportunity for me to get the spindle that I want. I like a spindle that's a little bit larger in diameter than my thumb. You can see that I should be able to get that from this piece of wood. And I like for my spindle to be a little longer than some people do. I like for it to be longer than from my thumb to point finger. You can see I've got at least an inch or two more than that, which is about perfect for me. So I'm going to go ahead and split this piece out so that I can start carving that spindle with my axe. You got a little bit of a knot in this piece of wood. It's all right, I can make that work. At this point, what I'll do is just use my axe to start to smooth this all out and make it somewhat round. So within just a couple of minutes time, you can see I've got this spindle somewhat rounded out with the axe, and I think it's going to be good enough. I could obviously fine tune it a little bit. At this point, I need to carve off the two ends of the spindle. The one that goes into the board to create friction, and the one that goes into my handhold, which hopefully will create less friction. So each one is subtly different. Let's start with the one that'll go in my handhold. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my knife now just to keep things simple. If I look at the spindle, this area right here has a bit of a knot in it, and that knot is going to be very hard, which will be good in my handhold because it'll create less friction and it'll create less wear on my actual spindle itself. So I'm going to use my knife to just kind of carve this down to a point. And a lot of times the analogy of a pencil is used when looking at a spindle. So one end is more sharp, like the pencil end that you write with. One end is more dull, like your eraser. So I'm just going to bevel this off a bit to a point. And you don't want to go too pointed because that will wear away also in your handhold. So I normally think just a little smaller than the tip of my pinky. Everything in the bow drill is all fine-tuned, understanding what's right and what's wrong and making subtle adjustments to correct any issues. The more you practice, the more you can start to analyze what's going on with the bow drill and what small motions you can make to correct whatever the issue is. So you can see what that looks like. I'm going to start with that, see how that does, and I'll fine tune from there. All right, let's fine tune the end that's going to actually mate against our hearth board. What I'm going to do is just start to bevel this off. I don't want to make this near as pointed as I did the other end. So this is the quote-unquote eraser end of the pencil. I do like to get mine down to a little bit of a point just to make it simple to mate with the hearth board. I'd rather have to carve a small divot on the hearth board to get the burn-in done. I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. That'll make more sense if you're not familiar. All right, so you can see what I've got here. It comes to just a little bit of a bull nose there. And when I make the little divot with my knife on my hearth board, that's going to kind of fit down in there and help me mate this up. So that's how I like to do the end of my spindle. And the last adjustment I'm going to make is just to smooth my spindle out a little bit, try to make sure that it's fairly round. You do want to keep some ridges on your spindle. Honestly, if you have it too smooth, it will start to slip sometimes in your cordage. So having these little subtle ridges in the wood helps it to bite into the cordage and maintain friction, especially when you start to put more weight down on this when you're about to get your ember. This will help you prevent that slipping that will sometimes occur when it's most important not to slip. All right, so that's my finished spindle, and I may have to make some subtle adjustments, but that's good for now. The next step in this process is to cut something that I can use for a bow. When I go to find a bow, I look for something that's hardwood and I look for something that's green. You don't want something that's brittle that might break on you, and at the same time you don't want something that's too flexible that'll start to give when you need to put pressure down most. Normally I look for something that's about the diameter of my thumb, and whether it's bowed or straight is not that big of a deal to me. This is a piece of maple right here, and it looks like it'll serve the purpose well. For me, the ideal bow length is from my armpit to my fingertip, and maybe even then some. A lot of people use a shorter bow than this, but what happens is every time you push and pull, you create a certain number of revolutions on your spindle. The longer your bow is, the less pushes and pulls that you actually have to make. The less times that you have to stop and start In other words, when you reverse gears forward and back, that's less pauses in your spindle. Your spindle rotates one way, then it rotates the opposite. It has to come to a stop before it switches direction. The longer the bow, the less of those stops, the less loss of heat, the faster you get your ember. So that's why I prefer a bow that's this length, just because it seems to work best for me. To set up the first end of my bow, I simply tie an overhand knot, which makes a stopper knot. Take that same end of the cord, come back, and tie another knot. That's simply a Canadian jam knot right there. And you can see one end of my bow has a little bit of a fork in it, so now I'll just cinch that down against that fork, and that makes that process very, very simple. Now on the back side of my bow, I'm simply going to create a little notch, and that notch will help me hold my cordage in place when I tie it to the bow itself. Doesn't need to be anything fancy at all there, just enough that it bites into the bow itself. Alright, to attach the cordage on the back end, I simply lay my bank line in the notch. I'm going to leave myself about 2 inches gap between the cordage and the bow itself. And now once I come over, I'm going to come back under the cord between the bow and the cordage itself, and that's going to help pull it tight. I wrap back around, come back through one more time, and then from here I'll just simply half hitch it off. It doesn't have to be fancy, and if you do it slightly different than that, it doesn't matter, because this will need to be adjusted probably at some point along the way, most likely, so we don't want anything that's not easily undone here. Alright, the last step in this process is to fashion a handhold that I can use to bear down on my spindle when I'm working my bow drill to create the friction. These are just a couple of pieces here of some fat wood. Hopefully you can see that up close and see all that resin in there. This is some very rich fat wood. I just broke it off of a stump about 100 yards out. I actually cut it with my baco right here. And if you can find fat wood, it is probably the best thing that I know of in the woods to use as a handhold, because it gets very little to no friction. If you don't have fat wood, the best thing to use is a piece of green wood that you baton in half and create a handhold. So I think this piece of fat wood's going to make a very comfortable handhold, and with all that resin right there, friction will definitely not be an issue. Normally when I drill with my knife, I'll put the piece down that I'm working on, but in this case I'm not pushing down towards the blade, I'm just spinning the piece of wood, so there's little to no chance that I'll slip and cut myself. But again, normally if I'm drilling with something with my knife like this, I'll put it down. Alright, so now I have a little divot for my handhold. So now you can see I have all the components for my bow drill set constructed, and it's time to start the burning in process. The last step to prep this set before I burn in is to figure out exactly where I need to make a small divot. And just placing my spindle on the board, I can see about where I want it to burn in. So right here, I'm going to use my knife to put a little bit of a divot to get started with. You want to be careful not to go too close to the edge, because then your spindle will end up working its way out of the board. So just a little less than halfway usually works about perfect for me. That should work right there. I can see that these two are going to mate together really well. Alright, let's start the burn-in process. To begin with, I've got to load my spindle in my bow. I use my knee, as you can see here, as a lever. I simply take the handhold end of my spindle and go between the bow and the string. And now I use my leg as a lever that I can twist this back. You always want your spindle to be on the outside of the string and the bow. It should never be in between here, as it'll bump up against the bow, but rather on the outside so you can get the longest strokes. I just have a piece of dry oak bark here on the ground to keep my set up off the wet ground, because it is very wet out here today. And that's it. I'm going to go for the burn-in process. Carefully place my boot here. The boot's been in the mud a little bit, so I'm going to be careful with that. You want to get yourself comfortable and get your shoulder directly over the spindle, so that way you can use your body weight and not so much strength. I'm really bearing down on that. And I'm already starting to see smoke, which is a good sign. that's it. Just like that, I've got my burn-in process started. I'm going to make sure not to put my spindle on the wet ground. Now we can take a look at what we got. You can see it's a dark brown to a light brown color there, which is really good. That's a good sign that this is going to be good dry wood and that the spindle and the hearth board are going to mate well together. You can also see that the end of my spindle has started to char a bit, and I'm going to use my knife to clean that char off just to get back to some fresh wood. All right, so I took my knife and just did a little bit of fine tuning there. I didn't remove all the char, but I think it's acceptable. Notice that I've got it set so it's very rounded here. I don't want this to shoulder out in the socket. I want to keep the friction down in the socket on the hearth board. When you get the fire hardening here from that heat, that dark part right there, you don't want to cut that off because that'll help this point last longer with friction in your handhold. Now, to carve in my notch. I want the notch to go about 1/3 of the way into the diameter of my socket. So I'm just going to use my knife and mark where I'm going to carve. So I'm just going to use my knife to kind of work out that little pattern there that I have carved into my board. Clear some of this wood out, and then I'll show you what the finished result looks like once I do that. All right, so you can see I've got my notch complete. I just used my knife to kind of work that out, and I've beveled it open just a little bit here at the bottom to allow oxygen to get in. You have to remember the triangle of fire. When I drill into this board, it creates dust. That dust becomes the fuel. The friction is the heat, and we have to have oxygen to get down in here to help that ember to form. I've beveled these edges here just so that as that dust forms, it won't spill out around the socket here, but rather feed down into this notch. Let's test it out. A lot of times I have to make subtle adjustments. We'll see how this functions. I want to make sure that I take the time to fill that notch up with the dust to make the fuel. With long, smooth strokes. Looks to me like it's smoking on its own there. Should have a good ember. It's a little stringy looking. Notice the fibers are kind of stringy there. But as long as it's an ember, I'll take it. Give it just a minute to kind of coagulate. Catch my breath a little bit. Make sure my tinder bundle is good to go here. Whenever I transfer my ember to my tinder bundle, I'm going to pick up this bark. I'm going to mate the two together. See that there? Try to be very gentle with that. Get that out of the way. Then we have our fire. All right, so you can see I was a little out of practice. It took 3 attempts to actually get fire. I did create embers successfully out of both of these sockets and transferred both of those embers into the tinder bundle. because my tinder bundle was damp, I believe is the reason that I did not get ignition. I just blew and blew until the ember blew out. And of course, those 2 embers helped to dry that marginal material out. So when I got my 3rd ember and I made sure I had a big whopping ember for that one, then I was able to complete it and get that fire rather quickly. So again, this is a perishable skill. Obviously, I remind myself once again that if I don't practice it regularly, it does start to fade. However, once you understand it, even after you fall off the horse, it's not that hard to get back up on. So anyway, I enjoyed coming out and practice this skill this afternoon while I had time. I appreciate you guys taking the time to tune in. Hopefully you picked up something if you're not already real familiar with this process, and I hope you enjoyed coming along at least just to see it. Thank you for your time, interest, and support. I look forward to talking to you with another video again as soon as possible. And until that time, take care and God bless.